welcome to another video and welcome to another Thomas Hardy video. And this video is just a preview video for the next book in the Thomas Hardy Readalong, which is going to be The Return of the Native, which we are reading in November. Before every month and before every month's read, I do a little introduction video just to tell you a little bit about the novel, a very small amount. In fact, this video, I've written a few notes for it, and I think there's going to be the least amount of description or least amount of plot I've ever given for a book. So there's going to be very little in it, but I'm just kind of trying to tell you a little bit about the kind of book that you're letting yourself in for if you read the next book in the read along with us. So I've got some interesting reviews, contemporary reviews that I want to tell you about, which I think give you a sense of what kind of book this is. So I've got a little bit of that, a little bit of description. That's what we're doing in this. So this is Hardy's sixth novel, and it was serialised in 1878. At first, he really struggled to find a publisher for it. He tried the usual places that he would serialise novels, which was Cornhills and Blackwoods, and they didn't want it because they thought it was too controversial, which I think gives you a sense of the kind of novel that you're getting here. He eventually published it with, I've completely forgotten where he published it. It was a very, very small publication, not very well known, so much so that I've forgotten what it was. But he did eventually get it published, and then it was published as a novel at the end of that year as well. So this is 5 years after, I think it's 4 or 5 years after he published Far from the Madding Crowd, which is the book that we read in October. The novel takes place in Egdon Heath, which is this kind of wild, desolate, empty, sad place for some who want to escape, some characters do, and a nice place to return to, as one character does. And it's set all over kind of this area. And it's also set over the course of a year, just over a year I think the book is set. So all of these events take place over that 1 year. It has been described by some as being a kind of classical tragedy novel, but with very modern themes. And it's those very modern themes that meant that Hardy really struggled to find somewhere that would serialise the novel. Now, essentially, yes, we have this young man who returns. He is the native who returns to his home area because he wants to settle down there and he wants to kind of live there. And then you've got a young woman who is attracted to him because she kind of thinks that he's going to then leave again and take her with him, and she really wants to get out of this town. But he has very different ideas. And that is essentially, very vaguely, the plot. But it's really not. I think we should be used by now to Hardy's love triangles. But what we have in this novel is very, very much more complicated. There is many different love complexities. There is sexual politics at play, there is desire, there's illicit relationships, there is death, there is drama, 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 everywhere you turn. As with all of these videos, I've got some great contemporary reviews, which I'm going to share in just a second, as to what people thought at the time of this novel. But I also really liked in these reviews the way that some of them summarised the plot. So I'm just going to read a few out to you so you get a sense of what the plot is. One reviewer at the time said, "The general plot of the story turns on the old theme of a man who is in love with two women, and a woman who is in love with two men, and the man and the woman being both selfish and sensual." They also said, "The story is a sad one, but the sadness is unnecessary and uncalled for." And then the review finished by saying, "It's all very mournful and very cruel and very French." So that should give you a sense of the kind of novel we're about to get into. So contemporary reviewers really didn't like this novel a huge amount. Quite a lot of them preferred not Far from the Madding Crowd, which came just before, but actually A Pair of Blue Eyes. The number of reviews that I came across that kept looking back to A Pair of Blue Eyes, which was Hardy's third novel, I thought was quite astonishing actually, and a lot of them overlooked Far from the Madding Crowd because they didn't really rate it that highly. One review said, "Mr. Hardy, who at one time seemed as promising as any of the younger generation of storytellers, has published a book distinctly inferior to anything of his which we have yet read." I would actually guess that the reviewer perhaps hadn't read some of Hardy's previous novels if they thought that this was inferior to all of them. The review goes on to say, "It is not that the story is ill-conceived. On the contrary, there are the elements of a good novel in it. But there is just that fault which would appear in the picture of a person who has a keen eye for the picturesque without having learnt to draw. One sees what he means and is all the more disappointed at the clumsy way in which the meaning is expressed." So I think it's safe to say this reviewer was not a fan But many of the reviewers were not a fan of this novel. Another reviewer, comparing it unfavourably to A Pair of Blue Eyes, said that the misery in Return of the Native was unnecessary and that Hardy was actually just being cruel to his characters for no reason. But the review did end by saying, in spite of these shortcomings, the novel is so clever and so strong that it excites both interest and admiration and takes a first place among the novels of the season. Some reviews said that the gloom and the misery in his story actually comes across as just dreary and just misery for the sake of misery, which I think is a really interesting criticism. Is Hardy actually just making the lives of his characters miserable for no reason? Is it because he doesn't have the imagination to see any other way for them to be? I don't think so, but I think that's a really interesting thing that I've never really thought of. One review that I thought was particularly interesting ended by quoting some of the text just to illustrate how beautifully Hardy writes and how he describes things, the phrases that he uses. And they said that it proved Hardy was not just a striking novelist, but in essence at least a fine poet, which I think is really interesting because at this point Hardy had published no poetry and he wasn't known as a poet because he hadn't published any. And he would later become much more well known as a poet. His career as a poet was longer than that of a novelist. So it's interesting that people are already picking out that his writing can be very poetic. Now, if you like to read your classics via audiobook, there are so many options with this novel. There have been so many recordings. I did a quick scour and I could just see maybe about 10 different versions available. I think the version everybody likes, and it is one that I have listened to and I really, really love, is narrated by Alan Rickman, and it's excellent. In terms of adaptations, I think there's been one either TV movie or TV, I think it's a TV movie rather than a TV series with Catherine Zeta-Jones and Clive Owen. I've not seen that myself. I don't think I've seen any of the adaptations. And I think there's an adaptation that's kind of then puts it forward in time. So it's kind of like a version using the story. I don't think there've been any kind of outstanding great adaptations. Unless I've missed one. I had a quick scour of the internet to try and find. I couldn't find anything, but let me know if you know of any. So the last thing I really just need to talk about is the misery scale. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this, what I'm trying to do is to give you an idea about how miserable each novel is. The reason for this is because Hardy's novels, I think unfairly, everyone assumes that every Thomas Hardy novel is full of misery and despair. And I think that's because a lot of his really big novels, a lot of his most well-known novels, a lot of his most popular novels can actually be very, very miserable. And what I'm doing is just giving a score. Now the score, just to clarify, because I have had a few people disagree with me about where I've marked it. It's just my opinion. This is not based on any kind of scientific analysis. The score is based relative to other Hardy novels. So I scored one book 0 and someone disagreed with that and said, well, actually, if you look at various things in the plot, you would say that these are quite miserable. But I think actually, when you look at other Hardy novels, there is nowhere to put the 0 other than at 0. No, it doesn't contain no misery, but relatively compared to some other Hardy novels, 0 is the right score for some. So with that in mind, the Return of the Native, I think, on the Hardy scale, so 0 being the Hand of Ethelberta, where very little misery happens, or Under the Greenwood Tree, very little misery happens, to 5, which I won't give any spoilers and say what novel is at 5, but there is one, just the one. I think that the Return of the Native is a 4 on the misery scale. So if you have been reading along with us so far, if you haven't yet read Return of the Native, or maybe it's been a long time and you've forgotten, and you've just read The Hand of Ethelberta, which, like I said, I think is about a 0, maybe a 0.5 if you're being picky. I think on the scale, Return of the Native, it really ramps up the misery, so be prepared for a 4. I think some people might think it's even higher, but if you think about what's to come, if you haven't read them, just trust me, I think 4 is probably where I'm going to settle with that. On my previous reads of The Return of the Native, it has always consistently, after I've reread all of Hardy's novels, come in my top 4 novels. I'm not going to say which order. I'll wait until the end to reveal what my previous orders have been. But Return of the Native has always been in my top 4. So I'm really intrigued to see where it ends up this time. Every time I reread a Hardy novel, I have a different reading experience and it feels different. And it depends on what else is going on in my life and in the world. So who knows where I will rank it this time, or how it will compare, if it will end up as, you know, the top of the ones we've read so far. I would assume so, but I don't know. So I'm really looking forward to reading it. If you've read it before, let me know your thoughts, let me know any impressions. It's great to have the comments so that other people can see them as well. If you've never read it, are you joining in? Let us know. If you're new to the read along, it's never too late to join in. You don't need to have read all the novels. Some people are just jumping in and out with whichever ones strike their fancy. So all of the links to everything will be in the description box below. There's a Discord, there's a Patreon where I kind of post similar sort of things to what I'm posting on YouTube, and the occasional poem, and there's also a chat function, which someone pointed out to me recently exists on Patreon. I didn't know it was there. So if you want to chat to other people, you can also use that as well. So all of the links to everything are in the description box below. Let me know any of your thoughts in the comments. And until next time, thank you so much for watching.